Okay, welcome everybody to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe or don't believe, whoever you love, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm a religious educator for adult RE here at the church. And today we're going to finish our series on the book of Judges by covering the stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. So a few key stories from the book. Let's see if I can get my slides working. I want to remind everybody that there is a class webpage. I apologize that the URL is confusing. There is a QR code if you want to take a picture of it, but it's sites.google.com, view biblical scholarship and literacy. And there you'll find links to the lectures, as well as any handouts, readings, additional recommended readings, that sort of thing. Last time, we talked about the book of Joshua, then the book of Judges, and we gave an introduction to the book of Judges. That was back in January. I apologize. I've been gone for 3 months. Different things have happened each time I was supposed to teach, and I had to miss class. But finally, we're getting back into it. So last time when we talked about the book of Judges, if you can remember all the way back to January, we talked about the authorship, who wrote it. We talked about the Deuteronomist and the Deuteronomistic history. We talked about the dating, and we said the book was probably written years and years after the events, hundreds of years after the events described, and by a group of people who seemed to be interested in explaining why God would allow the kingdom of Israel to be destroyed. And their answer is that they worshipped incorrectly, and their solution was that eventually God would raise up a deliverer and bring them back. To illustrate that point, they then used the book of Judges, which tells about this cyclic pattern of God selling the people into slavery when they disobey, and then raising up a deliverer who saves them. Again, from the perspective of people in the time period when it was written, that would have given them hope, we presume. We talked a little bit about the historicity. Did any of this stuff really happen? And we said the book of Judges lives at the intersection of a historical period in the later kings that we know is historical. By the way, historical doesn't mean everything in the text is true and true history. What we mean just is that it describes real events, maybe with a slant or whatever, but are we talking about real events or myth? That's what we mean by historicity. And we said that the book of Judges lives between a mythical past and a historical future, and it's the ongoing subject of a lot of scholarship and ongoing lively debate about the origins of Israel, because the book of Judges gives us a lot of hints about the origins of Israel. For example, that they lived up in the hill country while the Canaanites lived down in the valley, etc. And we see some of that mirrored in archaeological evidence. The dating of the time period from which it supposedly covers, we talked about that too. And again, we can pin some of that down with archaeological evidence for when the hill country begins to develop its own unique culture. We talked about how the book, if you just kind of lay the Judges out one after another, covers 400 or so years of history, but the archaeology gives us about 200 years for this time period. And we said one explanation for that, of course, is that it's not historical. But the other explanation, if you think it is historical, is that what we have, there's several judges who sort of reign concurrently. And we compared it to an Egyptian intermediate period. That time where there were multiple kings in Egypt. In this case, there's multiple tribal leaders and no king in Israel, and the two are comparable. Then we read a few things. We read some introductions, Othniel, Jephthah, and we talked about idolatry in Dan and the horrifying story of the virgin, the dismembered concubine. So here's the outline of the book, and that was all last time. There are 2 introductions to the book, and they're repetitive. When that happens, we usually think that we're dealing with a compilation of several sources. And in this case, the first introduction seems to go with the last chunk of the book, and the second introduction seems to go with the middle chunk of the book. So it's almost like the compiler had 2 accounts, both seemingly from a largely Deuteronomistic perspective, but the compiler had 2 accounts of these events of this time period and put them together into a single book, giving us 2 introductions and 2 kind of meat stories of the text. We talked about the major themes, this cycle of deliverance, the question of kingship. Do we want a king? The book of Judges has an ambivalent ambivalent perspective on kingship, although its end conclusion seems to be that we need a king. that things just get too far out of hand without a king. And that's in fact the point of the horrifying story of the dismembered concubine. This is how bad things get when you don't have a king, so we need a king. However, it preserves accurately, we think, some of the pre-kingship ideas of why kingship is bad. Specifically, the statement is made several times. We don't want a king because Yahweh is our king. God is our king. That's why we don't have a king. We are tribal leaders under the rulership of God. God is our king. If the author's point is to support the Davidic monarchy, he could have just cut those stories, but he didn't. He preserved these early anti-kingship stories. And the effect is to create a kind of whole where, yes, we need a king, but the king has to be the right sort. And of course, this is the hope of the later authors after the exile of the Jews, that they would go back and gain a king again, but a king of the right sort, of the line of David specifically. And so the author has a poor view of Saul. If you don't know who Saul is the king just before King David. David is the folk hero who unites the kingdom and is the king as kingship is supposed to be. Saul is king as the king is not supposed to be. And so the book of Judges looks forward to both David and Saul and actually has commentary on them by, for example, the town where Saul is from. It tells horrifying stories of that town, comparing it to Sodom and Gomorrah. And as we'll see today, the story of Samson is comparable to the story of Saul. So the author is shaping his stories, or the source material that the compiler compiles. I don't know exactly who does this, but whoever is writing this is shaping their stories to make commentary on the later kingship. So here's our cycle, right? The people, there's peace in the land. That causes Israel to disobey because they get complacent. So God punishes them and sells them to a person who oppresses them. The people cry out to the Lord, and the God raises up a judge, and the judge delivers them. Each of these deliverance cycles pay homage to the Exodus, the first main deliverance by God, which establishes peace in the land, and the cycle repeats. And these are our judges. There are 12 of them, a very symbolic number. In fact, it looks like the text was manipulated to make sure we have exactly 12. A few judges seem to be inserted in the middle of the text, and they break the flow, but somebody put them in there to make up the number so that it would add up to 12. Last time we told the stories of several of them, specifically this guy Jephthah who has this daughter. Remember, he sacrifices her to God. And we talked about, again, the point of the story isn't to say this is the way things should be. We should be sacrificing our children to God. The point of the story is this is horrifying, and this is how bad things get without a king. So we have the story of this judge who makes a foolish vow and sacrifices his daughter. We covered this last time. We had the story of Dan and how they became idolatrous. Again, this is part of the commentary of a later time. It's trying to explain why the priesthood in Dan is so messed up, because the priesthood in Dan was in competition with the priesthood in Jerusalem. And this is, of course, written, the Deuteronomist, by a later priest who has allegiance to the Jerusalem priesthood. So they talk about why the priesthood in Dan is so wrong. And of course, there is a temple in Dan. You can go there and see the archaeological excavation of said temple. And then we ended with the horrifying story of the dismembered concubine. This story calls back to Sodom and Gomorrah and some of the more horrifying stories. It is one of the more horrifying stories of the Bible where she's raped. Her husband seems to not care. He throws her out. By the way, the term concubine in the Bible means a lesser wife. It's a wife of they have almost like a several tier status of the different wives. So concubine is a lesser wife. She's a lesser wife of this priest who throws her out and lets her be raped all night, and then she dies, and he dismembers her body, sends it around to all the tribes, and calls them to war to get revenge. It's one of the worst stories in the entire Bible. And they then commit genocide to punish these people for what they did to this concubine. Almost like he didn't care about her at first, but after it happens, then now he cares. Again, a horrifying story, but that is really how the book of Judges ends, with that story, and then it moves. Ruth is an interjection, but the Deuteronomistic history would have moved straight from this story to the story of Samuel, who calls Israel's first king. In other words, things got so bad that we decided we need a king to straighten things out. And then we move to the story of Saul, the failed king, and then David, the successful king. So that was all yesterday. That's where we were at. Today what we're going to do is we're going to cover 4 of the more important stories in Judges, somewhat less horrifying, some of them, but interesting stories that we didn't have time for last time. So again, this is not in any chronological order. These are just some of the core stories. So since yesterday was was the introduction to the book, now we're going to tell some of the core stories. Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, and Samson. And of course, there's a nice movie, Samson and Delilah. So this is a story some of you have heard. Let's start with Deborah. Deborah is in Judges chapter 4 through 5, and she is one of our female judges. And she bucks the trend on a lot of gender stereotypes, especially gender stereotypes of so-called biblical Christians. They need to read Deborah a little more because maybe they'd have a different view of the role of women. But let's start in verse 1 of chapter 4. The Israelites, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell these stories in my own words, and I'm going to read some selected verses and then just kind of tell you what happens between the verses I skip, because there's no time to read all of them in full. So, verse 1. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold him into the hands of the king Gideon of Canaan, who resided in Hatzor, and the commander of his army was Sisera. Now remember the name Sisera because he's going to show up again. So this is the beginning of our cyclical pattern, right? Verse 4. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lipidoth, was judging Israel. By the way, this is really the only time her husband is mentioned. They give us his name and then they never tell us anything more about him because he does not matter. This is not what we are used to seeing. Let's see. So she notice she's a prophetess. I want to highlight this point. This doesn't just mean that she's a random person who happens to prophesy. It means she has a role in the government, or if you want, in the church, right? She judges people. In fact, she's the only judge who judges in the sense that we would understand the term, meaning sits in judgment of court cases. People come to her and says, he stole my cow, and she makes a judgment. And people abide by her judgments. This is someone who has authority and who prophesies. And so she's judging Israel, and she used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She heard court cases. I can't express how big a deal that is. This is rare, but it happens. This reminds me, of course, of Hatshepsut and some of the other, the Egyptian pharaohs. Every once in a while we have a female pharaoh. This is what we're dealing with. Even though she's married, by the way. She's married, and yet she is the judge, not her husband. She sent and she summoned Barak. So now we have the general, Barak. And notice the woman is summoning the general and telling him what to do. The son of Abimelech from Kedesh in Naphtali. And she said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, through me, by the way, go take possession of Mount Tabor. So skipping to verse 8, Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Apparently she was famous, beloved, and Barak doesn't want to go without her. He's like, you're commanding me to go to war. I want to make sure you're not hanging me out to dry. You're a prophetess. If you trust that we're going to win so much that you will go with me, I'll go. The man is expressing a certain amount of cowardice, I think, relative to Deborah, his commander. I also want to point out she's judging under a palm tree. This is one of several times that this idea of a sacred site or judging under a tree or sitting under a tree shows up in the book of Judges. This sort of thing shows up less often later in the Bible, but this is a text describing an early period. And we have, I think, early hints of early versions of Israelite religious practice and worship. This is the idea of the sacred grove as a sacred place where you meet God or meet the judge, etc., where you go to meet the oracle who gives prophecies about what is to come. And of course, they're especially associated with female deities. And here we have a female woman sitting under a tree giving prophecy. Again, this has some very old cultic roots. So Barak won't go if she doesn't go with him because I presume this implies a certain amount of cowardice on his part. And she responds by saying, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. We could assume Deborah, but it turns out it's not Deborah. We'll get to that in a minute. Skipping to verse 11, Deborah says to Barak, up, for this day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Not only does he goes to war, he camps on the side, I think, of a mountain, and Sisera hears about him and comes up to fight him. And then Deborah says, now is the time to attack. Notice that Deborah's not only, she's giving like the military instructions, the strategy to him. The Lord is indeed going out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him, and the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic. I don't know if you remember, but last time we mentioned that Israel controlled the mountains, and the Canaanites controlled the valley because they had chariots of iron. And here we have an army coming down from the mountain and defeating a bunch of chariots. We're not quite sure how he does this or what happens to throw them into a panic, but the chariots are thrown into a panic and they're defeated. Later, there's some hints, maybe in the poetic version, which I'll get to in a minute, that maybe it rained and the chariots all got stuck in the mud, and now they're no more effective as warriors than people on foot, maybe less effective, and the people on foot defeat them. So all the army of Sisera fell by the sword, and no one was left. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite. So here we have another person expressing cowardice, the male general of the other side. And he runs away, and he finds a woman, the wife of a Canaanite. Now, they are allies, and so he's assuming this is someone who will protect him. For there was peace between King Jabin of Hatzor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera. Jael is this woman, the Kenite. And she said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear. I'm going to make a comment about what is coming here. Exhausted, this is a commentary, and I'm just going to read this line from it because it sets the stage. Exhausted, he arrives at Jael's tent. She brings him milk, covers him with a rug, and while he sleeps, hammers a tent peg through his head, so you now know what's coming. The assassination incorporates multiple erotic images. This is a famous painting from 1962 of the event. I'm going to read a different translation, though, of that line. Remember, what I just read was, turn aside, my Lord, turn aside, have no fear. I like this translation better. My Lord, come in with me. Do not be afraid. This is a seductive line. Come into me. Right? She's going to protect him. And here he is, a grown man, the general, and needs protection from a woman. There's two things going on. One is some erotic overtones, but the second is infantilizing him and motherizing her. She is the mother, he is the infant, and we're gonna turn him into an infant. But there's this invitation that sounds sexual. And then Jael came. Let's see. Have no fear. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said, "Stand by the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone there?' say no." Now that line is, I appreciate this translation, trying really hard to use inclusive language, but this is what it really says. If any man comes to ask you, "Is there a man here?" say no. I think in this case, the original language is intentional and instructive. Is there a man here? No, there is no man here. He's turned himself into a child by relying on her. And notice he asks for water and she gives him milk and wraps him up in a little blanket. Again, there could be sexual overtones there. There could be just swaddling him like a little infant. He goes to sleep, according to this, and then we have the line where Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly into him, softly so she doesn't wake him up. Notice in this account he's asleep. I think in the poetic version, which we'll cover in a minute, he's awake. But went down and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. And then while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. According to several Jewish sources, Jewish tradition, later tradition, she had sex with him several times until he was weary. That's why he was so weary. And then while he's in the male I need to sleep afterglow, she drives a spike through his head. The 10th spike, by the way, is about its penetration, but it's the inverse. Right? He's being penetrated and driven into the ground. These things are intentional in the text. The text doesn't mind making sexual allegories and images, especially as a way to denigrate their enemy in this case. So notice Deborah, a woman, leads the command, but another woman kills him. So this is both empowering to women in the first instance, but in the second instance, I think we have to be careful. The story's been used as a woman power thing, but I think we have to be a little bit careful in the sense that the text is doing it to say he was so weak that he was killed by a woman, which isn't a good view of women. On the other hand, Deborah is not a weak woman. She's a strong woman leading the army, and she's more in charge than her general. So there's some nuance going on here that we have to if we're trying to take the text on its own terms, see. Now, Judges chapter 5 is a retelling of the same story. This is called the Song of Deborah. I talked about this last time in its implications for the historicity of the text, but this is possibly some of the oldest poetry in the Hebrew text. So again, we think this was written many, many years later, but they seem to have had access to a song or a poem that had been preserved that was much older. We assume it is older because it has archaic language, archaic images, archaic grammar forms, and poetry is the sort of thing you tend to preserve. But even more than that, it seems to almost have some older theology that the later Israelites might not have invented, older ways of looking at things. For example, when it lists the tribes, it gives us names for the tribes. Sometimes we've never heard anywhere else and never hear it. We have not heard before and will not hear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. So there were tribes in the olden days with names that weren't preserved into later antiquity, later times, and this old poem seems to preserve these old tribal names. It also preserves this great image of the Lord as a warrior. So this is how they viewed their God, but also notice he comes up from the mountain, Mount Seir. This is Mount Sinai in the south, next to Edom, which is next to Midian, which, by the way, Moses, I've talked about this before. I think it's very instructive for the origins of monotheism. Moses, according to the text, marries a Midianite. His father is a Midianite high priest. And suddenly, while he's on the mountain tending his father-in-law's flock, he has a vision where he sees a being who says, I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's not a Midianite God. But then he says, but my name is Yahweh. And I've pointed out several times that there is at least one inscription in Egypt that describes a god of the Midianites called Yahweh, which is probably the same person. So what seems to be happening is, I married my father-in-law's God. He happens to be the same deity that my fathers worshiped. We just didn't know his name before. There's a combination of the gods of El, his fathers, and the God of Yahweh as they become one deity. And that becomes very important for the evolution of monotheism. The merging of those two deities is kind of where monotheism itself comes from. In verse 7 of this poetic version, we get the line, the people prospered in Israel. They grew fat on plunder because you arose, Deborah. You arose as a mother in Israel. This is the greatest kind of epitaph they could give to her is this line, a mother in Israel. Notice she's married, she has children, but we never hear anything about her husband. He's not important. Now, this version tells another story of this tent peg business. Let's see. Let me just let me read this version here first, and then I'll show you the alternate translation. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. By the way, I would really like to know why she did this. Is it because she really had sympathies for Israel, or is it because she saw the tide of battle turning and decided to get on the winning side, or who knows? But in any event, she's blessed because of what she did. He asked water, and she gave him milk. Notice they've got to get that bit in twice. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank. He fell. He lay at her feet. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. This has very archaic Hebrew, so the translation of some of these lines is obscure. The term here translated feet is also applies to legs and thighs. And in at least several instances that we actually have, it is used intentionally as a euphemism for genitals. It's not always clear how we get from feet to genitals, but if we think about it as your thighs and we start talking about between them, it makes perfect sense. So let me read an alternate translation of that last line. Between her legs he collapsed. He went limp and was lifeless. Between her legs he collapsed and went limp in the spot where he collapsed. There he went limp, violently murdered. In fact, limp almost implies to me flaccid. So there's two things happening here. One is a birth, right? He's a child, and he's being and the blood of birth, etc. In this version, he seems to be awake, and she hits him over the head with a hammer, and he falls down between her legs, almost implying that maybe they were in the act of having sex. And then. So again, this is a slightly, I should point out, this is a slightly different version, and it disagrees with the earlier text version, but whoever was compiling this preserved both, this old poem and this later text story of the event. So I guess you can see how the authors are infantilizing their enemy, and I think it's very fairly clever, but also has some imagery that requires a certain amount of commentary to understand. But once you see it, it makes some sense, which is why I'm spending some time on it. The poetic version ends with a description of the mother of Sisera, and you would almost feel bad for her because it ends from her death. It skips straight to, out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera gazed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Where is my son? Why isn't he back? Notice it's to another mother, bemoaning the loss of her child. So another woman. Her wisest ladies made answer, but indeed she answers the question herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? Now I should add, by the way, we might be intended to feel sorry for the mother of Sisera for a second until she says this. A girl or two for every man, spoils. Okay, so she's talking about the reason he's late is because he's been victorious in battle and he's busy raping women. And isn't that great for my son? This drives home the reason for the sexual imagery in his own death, right? So what it's doing is it's intentionally turning rape on its head, literally. And we have a man who his mother thinks he's off doing raping people, being himself murdered by penetration from a woman instead, the other way around. So again, I don't think we're supposed to feel sorry for Sisera. What we've done is we've said, and then the story ends with, this is what God is going to do to all of his enemies. So don't be an enemy to God, because this is what he does to you. Is kind of how this. So perish all your enemies, O Lord. May your friends be like the sun as it rises in its might. And so again, this sort of mourning is what you get when you cross God. Is the way this story ends. Again, one of the oldest poems, we think, in the Hebrew Bible, has very interesting doctrinal implications, but also theological implications for the way Deborah behaves as a prophetess, etc. Which lets us skip to the next person, Gideon. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on Gideon because I want to spend a good amount of time on Samson, because Samson is a great story. Gideon is a good story, but we're just going to have to kind of go fast. Of course, the Israelites did what's wrong. They're sold into slavery by their enemies. God raises up someone to save them, and in this case is Gideon. So an angel of the Lord came and sat, verse 11 of chapter 6, under the oak at Ophrah. So here we have again this earlier cultic version of groves and trees as sacred spaces, almost temples, where God appears to people and calls them, either speaks through Deborah or calls, in this case, an angel appears to call Gideon to save the people. Verse 15, he responded, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord says, "But I will be with you, and I'll strike down the Midianites, every one of them." Then he said, "If now I have found favor with you, show me a sign that is you who speak with me." I should point out the Bible, especially the later New Testament, has an ambiguous relationship with signs. You remember in the New Testament, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, people come to Jesus and ask him for a sign to show that he is the Messiah, and he says, "A wicked and adulterous generation should not be given a sign." He says, "I will not do a sign." He does miracles, but he tells people, "Don't tell anyone because I don't want anyone to know." In those texts, you have to have faith and then you get miracles, but miracles are never given to produce faith. In the book of John, all that is turned on its head. In the book of John, Jesus does miracles, and he says, "This is given to you for a sign that you might believe." He does miracles specifically so that people will believe on him. Those two versions of that story are in conflict. Often not, the depth of that conflict is often not recognized. This is one of our Old Testament stories about signs. In this case, Gideon knows he's talking to somebody, but he says, "I need to know that you're really from the Lord." So the Lord lights an altar on fire for him. He brings out some sacrifices. Notice sacrifices under the tree. And the Lord lights the sacrifices, the angel. It's ambiguous. Is he talking to an angel or is he talking to the Lord, or is he talking to an angel that speaks for the Lord? In any event, the angel lights the sacrifice on fire for him. And then he's still not sure. And he's like, "Well, I'm going to go out to war, so I need you to show me that this is your will." You'd think he just saw an angel, it would be enough. But he puts out some fleece, and he's like, "Let the whole ground be dry, but let the fleece be wet." And he goes to bed, and he gets up in the morning, and that's what happens. It was dew on the fleece, but not on the ground. And then he says, "Well, maybe that's just the way things work." So he leaves it out again. He says, "God, if you want me to go to war this time, let the fleece be dry and the whole ground be wet." And that's what happens. So he's like, "Okay, God must be with me," and he goes to war. By the way, this is actually, that second story is the sort of divination before people go to war that you would actually expect from the ancient world. If you're going to go to war, you do some sort of divination to see if God's going to be with you and you're going to be victorious. So he does some sort of divination with this fleece thing. And it says what he's seeking is a sign to know that God is with him and that he's going to be victorious in battle. And then he gets all these troops, and he gathers up his army. Remember, he already said, "I'm the weakest. How am I going to win?" And he gathers up everyone he can. And instead of saying this isn't enough, God's like, "You got too many." So verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "The troops with you are too many for you to give the Midianites into your hands." By the way, if he just talks to God this way, I'm not sure why he needed the whole fleece thing. But in any event, he does the fleece thing, and then he starts talking to God, almost like he's chatting with his neighbor. But your troops are too many. And he says they're too many because people might think, this is the whole point of Gideon being from the weakest tribe, people might think you did this of your own power and strength, and I don't want that. I want them to know that I delivered them. So we're going to get rid of a bunch of these troops. Anyone who's afraid gets to go home. But that is not what you normally do to an army. If you're afraid, you don't have to fight, go home. Normally if you don't fight, we'll kill you because you have to fight. No, if you're afraid, go home. And then he says, verse 4, there's still too many. So this time we're going to take them to this water, and we're going to watch them drink. And anyone who kind of laps up like a dog, the water from the ground, like these people, these are the people you get to take. Anyone who drinks like this, or maybe it's the other way around. Anyone who drinks like this, you get to keep. And he cuts down the troops to 300, and he's going to defeat his entire enemy with 300 troops. And he does that by, they sneak up in the night. And the enemy's been having dreams, by the way, sent by God, presumably, that Gideon's going to come and kill them all. And then they sneak up in the night, and they have trumpets and a torch that they've all put under a little jar of some sort. And then they break the jar, which makes noise, and the torches all shine out, right? And so suddenly there's all these lights everywhere, and they're surrounding them with lights. And they blow these trumpets, and the enemy freaks out and runs away, and they kill them as they run. And his army of 300 scares the other people by making them think there's so much more of them than there are, and defeats them. The people, this is one of those great stories that are used to constantly say, Look how great God is. God is your real Savior, not these people. Then we get this story of kingship. Let me see. Verse 22 of chapter 8. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us out of the hand of Midian." And Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Remember I talked about preserving these ancient anti-monarchical talking points? This is the one that's constantly repeated. We see it in Samuel too, as well. The Lord is your God. He rules over you. You don't need a king. And so he makes a request of some money that he uses to make an ephod, which of course the people then worship, and we have this whole idolatry side point. Then he dies. Over in verse 31, his concubine bore him sons, and he named one of them Abimelech. Then Gideon, the son of Josiah, died in a good old age, and he was buried in the tomb of his father Josiah at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Apologize for slaughtering some of these names. So he's dead, which lead us to Abimelech. Sorry, my text is not properly organized on this slide. So let's see. Abimelech is his son. By the way, Gideon has 70 sons. Apparently it says he had a lot of wives, so he has 70 sons. One of them is named Abimelech, and the people come to Abimelech and said, "Hey, your dad didn't want to be king, but will you be king?" Remember, he said, "Me and my sons, we will not be king." Well, Abimelech says, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." So for 3 years in the book of Judges, Israel has a king, specifically Abimelech. Abimelech is a lot like Saul. He's a failed king who shows the failings of a king. So he gave a bunch of people 70 pieces of silver in verse 4 out of the temple, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him, and he went to his father's house and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men. Jerubbaal is another name for Gideon. 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, survived and hid himself. And then Jotham tells this poetic parable about a tree, and one tree wants to rule over the others, and it's the most worthless tree, because worthless trees are the ones who want to rule. It's an anti-monarchic parable about trees. And he curses his dad and the people for following his dad. And it says, then Abimelech begins to lose battles, and this happens so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might be avenged. So he killed them on a stone. I assume this is some sort of a chopping block, beheading stone of some sort, where they're all killed. So in chapter 9, verse 52, Abimelech is fighting against a group of people who flee to a tower, and he lights the tower on fire, and they all die. He fights another group of people who also flee to a tower. He does what he would normally do. He goes to the tower to light it on fire. Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it, and he came near to the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire, just like he did to one of his other enemies. But a certain woman, no named, threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. So again, we have a second story of a woman defeating the bad guy by crushing his skull in some manner or other. And by the way, what my commentary said, his brothers were all killed on a single stone, and in this case, a woman threw a stone at him. Actually, you know what? Sorry, I just had an extra slide I didn't delete. Here's the text correctly positioned. The irony of Abimelech's death is that he was killed by a single stone. His death recalls the way he killed his 70 brothers on a single stone. This is again, poetic irony intended to show you that he's being punished for what he did. So he, after the stone crushes his skull, he knows he's dying, and it says, immediately he called to the young man who carried his armor bearer, and he said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, so people will not say that a woman killed me." You'll notice again, just like Sisera, the idea of being killed by a woman is emasculating to a mighty warrior. So can't have that. So the young man thrust him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they all went home, and thus God repaid Abimelech for the crime he had committed against the killing of his father's 70 brothers. Notice this from 2 Samuel chapter 11. Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, Gideon? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone at him from the wall so that he died? Notice it didn't do any good, right? He was remembered for being killed by a woman, despite his desire otherwise. So thus ends Abimelech's aborted kingship. There are several other... Yeah, go ahead.
So how did Gideon... Where did we get Gideon's Bible? Why did that...
I don't know why the Gideon Bibles use Gideon's name as their... Maybe you know, but...
Just because of religious history, he happened to be related to someone who could publish all these Bibles.
But why use the name Gideon? Was that just like his name, or was it a reference to this story? That was just his name, okay. I thought maybe there was a reference to this story, and if so, I wasn't sure why they would reference this particular story. But
More modern
yeah,
Gideon.
but I'm sure that person was named after Gideon. But okay. So we get a bunch of other stories we skip. And several of them we told last time. They interject into the middle between the stories we're telling. But it's time to move on to. Right after the story of Jephthah and his daughter, by the way, we get the story of Samson. Samson is known for his mighty strength, and I would add, the Bible tells a story in Genesis of angels who come down and have sex with women and produce mighty men of renown, strength, mighty warriors. These are semi-divine beings, think Hercules, or some of the other Greek stories of the gods coming down and having sex with women and producing men with spectacular strength. That's the sort of thing we get in, and we're not told much about them in Genesis chapter 6, except that they existed and they weren't good people. They tended to be bad people. That's going to repeat itself here. And God got so frustrated with it, he sent the flood specifically in that story to get rid of them, it seems. They were causing so much trouble. Samson is not explicitly the son of an angel or anything like that, but he does have a miraculous birth, and he has this miraculous strength that really, it's very much like a folklore story. This story is often pointed to as folklore. It looks like almost like a story that originally had a Hercules-like divine figure that later gets a mortal, parent, and they take that bit out as they tell the story. But some elements of the divine birth remain in the story. So let's go through it. Chapter 13, the Israelites do what's evil, so God sells them. And there was a man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Dan, whose name was Menorah. His wife, in this case we get the man's name and not his wife's name, although the man plays no role. The woman plays all the role. I don't know why that is. It'd be nice to know her name instead. But his wife was barren, having no children. So an angel of the Lord appeared to the woman, not to the man. So this is like the Annunciation of Jesus, when the angel appears to Mary and says, "You're going to give birth." Only in this case, instead of being a virgin, she's barren. If this was from an earlier folk tradition of one of the Watchers, Nephilim, sort of angels coming down and being with women, then the story of the angel appearing to the woman creates a slightly different context. But that's not what we have in this story. I'm not trying to pretend it is, right? But I think it mirrors some of those stories, so it makes you go home when you see this part. But the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Although you are barren, having no children, you shall conceive and bear a son." That is also the line that God uses for Mary and Jesus. The point here, in both cases, is to raise up a deliverer to save the people who are sold into slavery. "Now be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, or to eat anything unclean, for you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth." Nazarite is a ritual production given in Numbers chapter 6 to make someone set apart for service to God. He's going to be set apart for service to God. And it's not like Jews can't drink wine or strong drink. It's that people who are set apart for God, these Nazarites, these special people, can't be. Samuel, also miraculous birth, and also is set apart for special service to God, and also is a Nazirite. He takes the Nazarene vow. For God from his birth. It is he who shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Notice he will begin to deliver Israel. This is important. We'll get to that in a minute. So God listened to Manoah, her husband. So she comes and tells her dad this happened, and Manoah's like, man, I'd like to have seen it. So God listened to Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman as she sat in the field, but her husband was not with her. That is the second time, by the way. The angel appears to her, and the husband is gone. This time she runs quickly and tells her husband and brings him, and they talk. And then in verse 17, Manoah says to the angel of the Lord, what is your name so that we may honor you? So now finally the husband gets to show up and meet the angel. What is your name that we may honor you when your words come true? But the angel said to him, why do you ask my name? It is too wonderful. This is one of several references to sacred names in the biblical text. This is also something we see in Canaanite and Egyptian mythology, that names have power, and knowing someone's secret name gives you power over them, or also that names are just so sacred that you don't get to know them or hear them. And then later, Manoah took the kid with the grain offering and offered it on a rock to the Lord, to him who works wonders. And when the flame went up towards heaven of the altar, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar, while Manoah and his wife looked on or wondered. So that there's a play on words here. And they fell on their faces to the ground. And then Manoah says, we shall surely die, for we have seen God. But his wife said, if the Lord meant to kill us, he would not have accepted the burnt offering and the grain offering at our hands and shown us all these things, or now announced us such things as these. So clearly she doesn't think they're going to die. She thinks this is a miracle, and then she gives birth. Her child she names Samson. Now once Samson grows up, and then once, chapter 14, verse 1, when he went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw a Philistine woman. Over and over again, the problem that the Israelites, have is that they're marrying Canaanites or Philistines, either one. And the reason that's a problem is because then they start to worship the Canaanite gods. It's not a you can't marry outside your race thing. It's a they'll lead you astray and you won't worship Yahweh sort of thing. So it was a no-no. You're not supposed to marry outside of Israel. And the first thing we hear about Samson when he's grown up is that he sees a woman, and he came up and told his father and mother. Notice the demanding way he says this. I saw a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now give her me for wife. I mean, this is the archetypical caveman, right? You got to almost read it with that accent. And his father says, is there not a woman among your kin, among all the people, that you must go to a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines, our enemies and our oppressors, by the way, who are keeping us enslaved? And his response to his dad is, get her for me, because she pleases me. Okay, Samson. This guy, it's hard to figure out what to do with Samson, and I'll talk more about what to do with him, but he was set up as a hero, and the first thing we hear out of his mouth, he does not seem very hero-esque. Very much like the Nephilim of old, he is a mighty man, a strong man, but not necessarily a man of very great character, and he creates chaos everywhere he goes. Verse 5, Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah. When he came to the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion roared at him. Now here we get the exciting bit, right? Now the story's going to get exciting. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he tore the lion apart, bare-handed, as one might tear apart a kid. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked, and after a while he returned to marry the woman, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. So he went home, he saw her, he was going down to organize her hand in marriage. He gets it, he goes home, then he goes back to marry her, and he sees the carcass of the lion he killed. And there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion, and honey. And he scraped out with his hands and went on eating the honey as he went. And he came to his father and mother, and he gave some of the honey to them, and they ate it. But he didn't tell them where he had taken the honey from or the carcass of the lion. He's not telling them the lion story. It's almost like the lion story is this sign or omen of his power and that out of his violence something good and sweet might come, we hope. So for some reason, which we do not know, it makes no sense, but for some reason Samson decides to give a riddle to the people at his wedding. The Philistines, he's down in Philistia, marrying a Philistine woman. He's got all these Philistines, his enemies, the enemies of his people, hanging out with him. And he decides, I'm going to play a trick on them, and he's going to give them a riddle. And he says, I only put a riddle to you. If you can explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast and find out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments, something of reasonable value. But if you can't explain it to me, you will give me 30 linen garments and 30 festival garments. I think this is a good deal because, as I understand, it's hard to tell, but it sounds to me like he's going to give 30 to each of them versus they're going to give 30 to him. So it's a good deal, and he's offering them. It's like a gambler offering them a gambling trick. If they can just guess his riddle, and they think, well, this is a good enough bet. Let's see if we can answer his riddle. So they said, ask your riddle, let us hear it. And he says, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. It's nice that the translation rhymes in English. But this is a riddle about the lion, right? No one's going to be able to guess this because he's the only one who knows anything about. This is actually not a fair riddle in Tolkien-esque terms. This is cheating. But no one can answer this riddle except him. So after 4 days of trying, they come to his wife and they're like, you got to get this guy to tell you the answer to his riddle. If he can, by 4 days, 5, 6, 3, if he can wait 3 days, he gets the linen. But she spends the next 3 days, it says nagging him. And the word nagging will show up when Delilah shows up later in the tale. So we'll get nagging again. The nagging woman. She nags Samson until he says, look, I have not told my father or my mother. Why should I tell you? And she wept before him the 7 days that the feast lasted. And because she nagged him on the seventh day, he told her. And he explained the riddle. She explained the riddle to the people. And the people came to him on the seventh day and said, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than the lion? And he said, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. It's a great way to describe his wife, but he's clearly aware of where they got the answer from. So he's got to somehow pay up on his debt. So he does. He goes out and he kills a bunch of Philistines. He murders a bunch of Philistines, takes their linen garments and gives them, says, see, here, I've paid up my debt. He pays his debt by killing a bunch of Philistines. The implication here, by the way, is that it said earlier that he's acting like a moron, but God is behind these events, we're told in this event. So God is using this as a way to make Samson angry, because when Samson is angry, he kills people, and God seems to want to raise him up to kill the Philistines and thereby save Israel. So Samson, in his anger, kills a bunch of Philistines, and through this whole riddle thing ends up taking the first steps to the deliverance of Israel. Of course, the Philistines are not very happy, so Samson runs away. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man at his wedding. So his wife gets given to his best man because he's gone. But in chapter 15, Samson comes back and says, I would really like my wife. And the guy's like, well, I gave her away to your best man. Sorry, you were gone. I didn't know you were coming back. And Samson's like, my wife. And he's like, well, how about have her younger sister? And he's like, no, my wife. And he says, no. And so Samson goes out, grabs a bunch of foxes, ties their tails together. By the way, I have no idea how this would even work. It probably wouldn't. And puts torches between. I don't picture him smiling while he does this, by the way, but he puts torches between the tails of these two foxes and lights the torches on fire, and he ties the two torches' tails together. Well, I don't think you can tie foxes' tails together, but I think you could maybe take a rope and tie them around the tails and to the torch, and then you light the torch on fire. Of course, the foxes are going to try to get away from the burning branch, and they're going to run, and he sets them loose in the Philistines' fields. And it burns their entire fields down because he's mad that his wife has been given to his best man. Of course, that would probably make me angry too. He says, if this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I have taken revenge on you. This is one of several times Samson utters the word revenge, because everything he does seems to be out of revenge for messes he's gotten himself into. Well, revenge for things that happened to him because of messes he got himself into. So he needs revenge. Then he runs away. The Philistines come to the Israelites and they're like, hey, give us Samson. Samson's done this horrible thing. We're gonna execute him. Give him to us. So the Israelites come to Samson and they're like, we're going to take you to the Philistines. And Samson's like, well, you promise you're not going to hurt me? And they're like, yeah, we're not going to hurt you. But we're just going to give you to the Philistines. They're going to hurt you. But at least he doesn't have to fight his own people. So he says, okay. He holds out his hands. They tie him up and they drag him out to the Philistines. And they give him to the Philistines. He immediately breaks the ropes. And let's see, let me see if I can find this. When he came to Lehi, the name of the place, by the way, Lehi means the jawbone of an ass. So he came to a place named Lehi. The Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. Every time he has mighty acts of strength, it says the Spirit rushed upon him. There's something divine about his strength. It's not natural. The Spirit rushed upon him, and the ropes were on his arms break like flax that had caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. And he reached down and took it, and with it he killed 1,000 men. And thus the name of the place was called Ramath-leah, which means the hill of the jawbone, because he made a hill out of their bodies. So again, they tried to capture him, and he ends up killing a bunch of Philistines. And then there's even this miracle where God splits open the hollow place at Lehi, and water comes out, and he drank because he was thirsty. He was thirsty, and God gave him water from a rock, mirroring Moses, by the way. And the spring is there to this day, it says. So again, this is a story explaining where this miraculous spring came from. It came forth when Samson called for it. And then this is this story. Sorry, I should have had this picture up. This is Samson killing all the people with the jawbone of an ass and making a hill out of their bodies. Then we almost get a separate story. And it says, once Samson went to Gaza. This is almost like a once upon a time. So now we're telling you another story about Samson. A different wife, by the way, but it's again a story about Samson and a wife who gets him in trouble. Once Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. This tells us something else about Samson. And I want to make a brief comment. I think it's very interesting about sexual mores in the Old Testament, because I think it's misunderstood. Judah also visits a prostitute in Genesis, and no one seems to care. We have a Victorian view and we read the Bible from that point of view, where sex itself is the problem, and sexual immorality gets people stoned. The penalty for adultery is stoning. But people go to prostitutes all the time, and no one stones the prostitute, no one stones the man. So what's the deal? And why are the prostitutes tolerated? And the answer, I think, is instructive, and it also tells us something about the place of women in the biblical text. The problem isn't sex that they're angry about. The issue is inheritance laws. And we often will say women are property in the Bible, but it's not so simple. It's not that women are property, it's that if they have a child, the child will inherit property. And if the child is not the man's, who is married to her, that is grand theft of everything he owns. And they had a very, very dim view of that. And their laws about sexual behavior are designed to mitigate that issue. So if a woman has sex with somebody who's not her husband, she is put to death. But it's not a double standard in this sense, because the man who does this is also put to death. But if the man has sex with a prostitute where there is no issue of inheritance for either the prostitute or for him, no one cares. And so I think that's just kind of, I don't think it was enjoyed, like in the sense that it was a good thing, that their society didn't look on this as a good thing, but it was tolerated, and no one is put to death, at least. But certainly I think pointing out that Samson is visiting a prostitute is not intended to make us look fondly on him, but it's also not intended to make us think he needs to be put to death. Again, inheritance laws are the key to understanding the sexual taboos of the Old Testament. So Samson comes into her. Now this story is really bizarre, by the way. He goes into her, and the people are like, well, hey, when he comes out in the morning, he's going to be there all night. When he comes out in the morning, we'll kill him. So the Philistines lie in wait to murder Samson when he comes out in the morning. But he doesn't come out in the morning. He comes out in the middle of the night. And they're hanging out by the gate. And he walks up to the gate where they're hiding, rips up the entire gate. 2 pillars, by the way, which foreshadows his eventual death. He rips up the 2 pillars of the gate and he carries it off to another town. No explanation of why he does this. No comment about killing the people who were lying in wait for him. But we know they were lying in wait under that tower. And he just picks up the tower and carries them off. Carries the tower off. And like they wake up and the tower's gone. I don't know what they're trying to say here. This is one of the more obscure kind of stories about Samson. But it certainly sets up his strength. He rips up an entire tower and 2 pillars, which is going to play a role in his eventual death. And after this, it says, right after this, he's busy visiting prostitutes and ripping up towers and carrying them off. After this, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Now, we do not know whether Delilah is a Philistine, but she doesn't seem to be an Israelite. So here we go again. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, "Coax him and find out what makes his strength so great and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him in order to subdue him. And we'll each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." Clearly, Delilah does not love Samson. They told her what they're going to do with him. And they're offering her money, and she's willing to betray her husband for money. Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes your strength so great." Clearly, there's a secret. It's strange that they assume there's some secret to his strength, but they do. It's clearly miraculous, so clearly there's some magical property to it. And if there's a magical property to it, there must be some, like a superhero movie today, he must have a weakness, kryptonite. They know he's got a weakness. They just need to find out what it is. So he lies to her 3 times and tells her these stories. Well, if you bind me with a new rope, if you bind me this way, if you do this, if you do that, then I'll lose my strength. And in every case, he is lying. And in every case, they immediately try it and fails. He knows she's telling them. Like this, the internal logic of the story, the author knows that he knows because of this 3 repeated times where he tells her and somehow the Philistines find out. How did the Philistines find out? Go figure. It's got to be your wife, dude. And yet, somehow, verse 15, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times now and have not told me what makes your strength so great." Does she love him, though? Finally, after she had nagged him, here we go again. I love that translation, by the way, repeated from the earlier story of his first wife. When she nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, and he was tired to death. So he told her his whole secret and said, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb." His strength comes from being set aside to God. He is not set aside to God in any way, shape, or form in his behavior, in his motives, in anything. But he's been set apart for God for a great work to deliver Israel, and that's where his strength comes from, he says. So it says, "If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me." So they come to her and they brought the money in their hands, and she let him fall asleep on her lap. Again, sounds like stories we've heard earlier, relation to heads and women's laying on their laps. And she called a man and had him shave off the locks of his head. And when he woke, he did not know that the Lord had left him, so the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him in bronze shackles, and he ground the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved, and they were not smart enough to keep his hair short. I'm not sure where that comes from. And then later it says, "When their hearts were merry, they said, 'Call Samson and let him entertain us.' So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them, and they made him stand between the pillars." And then he says to the attendant, let me feel the pillars, because I'm blind, I can't see, let me know where I'm at. Feel the pillars. They lean him over against the pillars. He puts his hands, one on each pillar. Samson called to the Lord and said, now notice his prayer to God. This is not the sort of thing we expect of a prophet we're supposed to look up to. Watch what he says. "Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of revenge, I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned all his weight against them, and his right hand on one and his left on the other. And Samson said, 'Let me die, with the Philistines, almost a suicide. Well, it is. He knows he's going to die, but he's giving his life to kill the Philistines. But not to kill the Philistines. He's not sacrificing his life to kill the Philistines so that he can save his people. He's doing it so he can have revenge for his 2 eyes. And why did he lose his 2 eyes? Because of his own stupidity, right? So he strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords of the people who were in it. These were the leaders of the Philistines that all gathered together for a party. And he now kills all the leaders of the people who oppressed him. So those killed at his death, and all the lords and all the people who were in the house, and those he killed at his death were more than all those he had killed during his entire life. Then his brothers and families came and brought his body, and they buried him, etc. Thus endeth today's Bible story. What in the world to do with Samson? Again, I'm not asking necessarily a historical question. Again, my point is not to convince you that Samson didn't live, but I assume he's a myth. There could be elements of historicity behind some of these myths or fables, but that's my assumption. But again, I'm not trying to convince you of that. I don't care if you believe he existed or not. But whether he existed or not, we can ask an important literary question of this story that has been told, retold, and made into movies for generations. And we can ask the question, what does the author want us to do with Samson? Is he a deliverer who saves his people? Or is he a failed deliverer who fails to save his people because of his own selfishness, stupidity, and predilection for horrible women? What is the author what is the moral? I mean, is there a moral to the story, or is it just recounting history? If so, why this story? What's the point? I do not know, but I believe the ambiguity of the story is intentional. Because there are at least 2 ways to read this story. Notice it said he would begin to deliver his people. You could ask the question, what could Samson have done with his mighty strength if he had been a better person? Maybe he really would have finished delivering his people if he had just been a better person. But the other way to read the story, and it's one hinted at in the story 2 times at least, is that God knows what's coming, and God uses a horrible person and the horrible things this person does to accomplish his goals. Because in the logic of the story at least, God wants the Philistines to die so that Israel can be saved. Israel is saved as the Philistines who are oppressing them are killed, very much like the parting of the Red Sea. Samson's act between the 2 pillars is like Moses' act striking the rod between the water and parting the Red Sea and then drowning the Egyptians behind them. God is saving his people by killing his people's enemies in this case. And Samson is this deranged, selfish, rabid lion that God turns loose on his enemies and slays them, without Samson being someone you're supposed to look up to in any way, shape, or form. So again, there are at least 2 ways to read that story, and I've given kind of both of them to you. I think the author could have clarified which of those 2 he wanted you to use, but I believe the author didn't want you to, or didn't want to clarify, wanted it to be ambiguous. And the only reason I can think of for that is that the author enjoys making us ask questions, like the ones I just did. For example, I have a friend who tells the story and says, I made horrible mistakes that led to horrible outcomes, but I learned very important things, and God clearly had a plan, and that plan included my mistakes. And by the way, I used to say something similar about several events in my life. I did something stupid, but clearly something good came of it because God can use even my stupidity and my mistakes. That is a very useful way to read the text, and I'm sure people have read it that way for years and years, and the author wants to leave that option open. But I think the author really wants us to also ask the question, what could he have done? What more could he have done if he had been a better person? If his moral strength had matched his physical strength, what could this man have achieved? And I think God, the author, wants us to ask that question because maybe that will motivate us to maybe use our strength in better, less self-serving, self-destructive ways. Because at least we can say Samson's actions were self-destructive. They got him blinded, and eventually he died with his enemies instead of saving himself and his people as maybe he otherwise could have. So there is our story. I want to give some resources for further reading, especially for the believers. This is The Bible for Normal People, is a podcast. I highly recommend it for liberal believers who are interested in seeing how people who don't believe in kind of the literal inerrancy of the Bible still use these stories and make sense of them. And in season 6, episode 233, Pete, with his tongue firmly in his cheek, ruins Judges, which basically means he talks about it. Very useful information. A lot of the stuff I got here I took from his podcast. He also had podcasts on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Joshua, Judges. He ruins all of these, and the episodes are titled Pete Ruins Genesis, Exodus, etc. Very good podcast. I highly recommend this translation. But not only this translation, it's really good to get this version because it has very good footnotes and commentary. For example, the introduction to the book of Judges is about 2 pages, but it is one of the best, most succinct introductions to the book that I've ever read. Very good, very useful stuff. I used it a lot in last class. The Anchor Bible Commentary is my favorite commentary on the Bible. This is the version of Judges that I've used. These books are about $50 a piece. I own about 4 of them, but I used to use the rest of them at the library at Brigham Young. Unfortunately, they don't exist in the library here. I've been trying to get it'd be nice if the Los Alamos Library would get this series for us, because then you could go and grab a copy without spending $50. But this is the one I was familiar with and used when I was young in college. It was written the year before me, 1974. It's a year older than me. But there is a new version out now. I have never used said new version, but I'm assuming it's really good, so I recommend it without ever having read it, because it's from the same series that has always put out really good commentaries. So that's the end of our book of Judges. Next, we're going to do Ruth. Ruth is an interjection between Judges and Samuel when Israel gets a king. This is about how bad things get without a king. Samson almost is a failed king, much like Abimelech. But now we get the introduction to David and things in the book of Samuel. Ruth is an interjection between them, and it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. I love Ruth. So we're going to do Ruth. But then I think it's a good point to take a little bit of a break, and then I want to move into some comparative religion classes. I want to talk about Islam. We've done Islam before, but never when I was recording these. So I don't have a copy of anything on Islam online. So I'd like to record Islam for my online viewers. I'd like to also start doing some discussions of mythology from all around the world and talk about these myths that kind of preceded Jesus Christ and that have similarities, and kind of put them all together and tell a story about that. I think it'd be very interesting. I'd like to do that for Satan too, how we ended up having a devil. And after that, I am open to suggestions about what you guys want to hear. But I'd like to spend a little while on some comparative religion, and then we'll go back and do Samuel, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. So, are there any comments or thoughts before we send everyone? Yeah, go ahead.
Why was it called the Book of Judges?
Why was it called the Book of Judges?
Was it because it was establishing or to teach a lesson?
So this is one of the few books that has the same name in English, Greek, and Hebrew, Judges. Often books in the Hebrew are named after kind of the first few words of the text. In this case, that is not the case. It's named Judges because buried, I think, in chapter 1 or 2, there's a line that talks about how there was no king and instead there were judges who judged Israel. The text only uses that term to describe Deborah later on, but in the introduction it says there were judges because there was no king. And so this story, Joshua is the story of Joshua conquering the land, and Samuel is the story of Samuel who anoints a king, and then you have 1st, 2nd Kings. Judges sits between the two, and it uses the name judge because it's trying to refer to these men who led Israel, men and women, who led Israel during the time period between Joshua and the death of Joshua and Moses and the rise of kingship. Between kingship and Joshua, there was this chaotic period of tribal leaders, which almost certainly has a memory of a true, anarchistic time when there were these various tribal collaborations that later coalesced into a nation. This is the time before the nation of Israel, led not by a king but by judges. And then the story is the 12 judges, Samson being the last of our 12 judges. And so I think that's where its name comes from. But it's important to note that they don't, only Deborah judges in the sense we have, where, here's court cases. These other people are more like Samson, or they're military leaders or whatever. These are people who lead in some capacity, often a military capacity, to deliver them. I think a better name might have been the book of the deliverers, right? These 12 deliverers. This is the book of the 12 deliverers who save Israel time and time again when Israel keeps getting itself in trouble and God raises up a deliverer to save them. Yeah.
So, number 7, Jael, a judge who ruled Israel for 22 years and had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. Is that his whole story?
Yeah, and you notice he gets 3 verses. That judge gets 4 verses. So there's a couple of them that get chapters like Samson, and then there's a couple that get like 3 verses. And the number is 12, and we don't get a lot of information about some of them because their story just isn't as interesting as Samson killing a bunch of people with the jawbone of a donkey. It's just, there it goes. Any other thoughts, comments? All right, so thank you all for coming so much. It's great to see you here. I hope that what we've shared helps you on your life's journey, and I hope to see you again next time.